Florence Nightingale is one of the most beloved figures of British history. A nurse, social reformer and statistician, she's generally considered the founder of modern nursing. She's commemorated on statues, plaques, and even made it to the £10 note. Here in the heart of London, tucked behind St Thomas's Hospital, is an extraordinary museum dedicated to the lady with the lamp. I've come to uncover the secrets of her success with head curator David Green.
Hi Dave!
Hiya, nice to see you, thanks for coming.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. I'm thrilled to see what you've got to show us.
Yeah, it'd be great to tell you all about Florence Nightingale, and we'll start off with one of our most popular exhibits, and that is Athena the Owl.
So how does this little creature relate to the Lady in the Lamp?
Well, everybody knows that Nightingale had a lamp, but what not many people know is that she had a really beloved pet owl. She rescued this owl when she was in Greece, actually at the Acropolis. It was injured, some boys were attacking it, and Florence, in true nurse style, came to the rescue, was very brave and told the boys they shouldn't be doing that, but popped her in a pocket and took her home. And she stayed basically with Florence, often living within her pocket, right the way until Nightingale left to go to the Crimean War. When she went away, Nightingale really didn't think the war was going to be the place for Athena, so she asked her sister Parthenope to look after the owl. Sadly, Parthenope wasn't that impressed by that idea, and it's widely regarded that because Athena was quite bad-tempered, Parthenope popped her up in the attic where she wouldn't have to put up with her. And sadly, while she was up in the attic, she actually did pass away. And so, in true Victorian style, it was quite typical for Victorians to actually employ some taxidermy and make sure the owl was there to welcome her when she came back from the Crimean War.
It's not quite the same not being alive though.
It's a real shame, and Florence was very upset when you can see from the correspondence how disappointed she was. But Nightingale was an animal lover throughout her life. She nursed many animals back to health, just like she did with people, and you can imagine this is a really popular exhibit, particularly with small children who can always empathise with someone who had a pet.
Yeah, and never to trust your sister, I'm sure.
Very much so.
So Florence was in Athens with her sister at a very young age. Can you tell me why she was out there?
Florence came from a very wealthy family, and in fact she was born in Florence, hence her name, and her sister Parthenope was born in Naples. They were both born on their parents' honeymoon, and I think it says a lot about how wealthy they were, that actually they went on a 2-year honeymoon, hence why 2 children were born. This was while their family home down in Hampshire was being renovated, so it was suitable for them to live in. They went travelling, as a lot of Victorians did. They felt it was a great education. But on this occasion, Florence was in Athens because she'd been sent away by her family to travel, because Nightingale felt she'd been called by God to do something special. And she felt after a while that something special was being a nurse. But nurses at the time it wasn't a profession. What it was ladies would do it usually for some gin money, if I'm honest, and Mrs. Gamp, the Dickens character, is the best example of this. And so it really wasn't what a Victorian lady should be doing, particularly as, by the nature of nursing, you'd be touching other people's bodies, and that's completely inappropriate in Victorian society. Her parents were horrified at the thought of this. They wanted her to marry well, to lift the status of the family. And so they sent her away to travel in the hope that she'd grow out of it, a little bit like you'd send a student on a gap year now. Yeah. But instead of growing out of it, she actually became more and more interested while she was away. And she travelled on from Athens onto Egypt. And it's while she was in Egypt that actually she felt God spoke to her again and said, "You really should become a nurse. I want you to establish nursing as a profession."
But it wasn't all plain sailing. To fulfil this divine task, Florence would first have to overcome the prejudice of the time.
She lived in the gilded cage of Victorian society where ladies should be ladies. The picture we've got just here, it's quite unusual because Nightingale is not the one holding the book. And we always think of her as being very bookish. She loved reading. She taught herself how to speak a number of different languages, including Hebrew. But in this picture, we actually see Florence sitting down doing some sewing, which is much more traditional, the way her mother would have liked her to have been. We think this picture was actually done in order that they could use it as a way of showing the gentleman that there were two very attractive young ladies around. And actually, as they didn't have a brother, they were going to be wealthy young ladies too. But Nightingale wasn't interested in that. She wanted to establish the nursing profession, and eventually it was her father who supported her. I think that's entirely fair, because her father was the person that had made sure that she'd had such a brilliant education for a young lady. He'd tutored her herself where he could, in maths, in numerous different languages, which is so different from what most girls in the day would have had, where it would have purely been about looking after the house. But her father agreed in the end and actually sponsored her to actually go to Kaiserwerth in Germany, where the deaconesses were actually thought to be the best nurses around at the time. They were actually nuns, but caring and working in a convent were very, very linked with each other. She learnt from that, came back, and shortly after got her first job, although she wasn't paid for it. Her father continued to support her, and that was in Harlesjute at the Institute for Gentlewomen, basically looking after middle-class ladies where life had just become a bit too much for them.
What kind of work was she doing there?
Really, Nightingale proved in that role what a fantastic organiser she was. While she was in that role, she sorted out all the budgets of the place, she organised a big clean-up and actually got hot running water into the hospital at the time. It was there she started to formulate a lot of opinions about the importance of cleanliness and of orderly staff, in order that the staff did actually look after patients. One of Nightingale's great phrases later in her life was that it was really important that the hospital did the patient no harm. And I think that really shows just what the state of the country's hospitals were.
And what was the state of it? Was it pretty horrific?
They were generally dirty and run by people who weren't that interested and just wanted to make the money. And like I said, the women in particular were often in it for the opportunity to meet either young men or to make sure that they got enough money for their gin for the day. Right. And so Nightingale started to really think about the importance of care, the importance of cleanliness. But it's while she's working at that hospital that the Crimean War breaks out. And what's really interesting was that while she was on her travels, she met Sir Sidney Herbert, and they became lifelong friends. Okay. But by this point, Sir Sidney Herbert was actually the War Minister, and the Crimean War was going very, very badly for Britain. Right. It was another one of those wars where everybody thought it would be over in a matter of weeks, and in fact, it was on the Russian front in winter.
The Crimean War began in 1853 after Tsar Alexander I's troops pushed into territory controlled by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. This area, known as the Danube region, is part of modern-day Romania. Such aggressive Russian expansion rang alarm bells for European powers. By 1854, the Russians began withdrawing, and it seemed the conflict was drawing to a close. But the damage was already done. Britain and France were in the grip of war fever, and Russia now faced a formidable alliance, including the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France. After invading the Crimean Peninsula in the autumn of 1854, the Allied forces scored a victory at the Battle of the Alma, and then besieged the vital Russian naval hub at Sevastopol. The Crimean conflict became infamous for shocking winter conditions and terrible military failures, such as Lord Cardigan's disastrous charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava. As British casualties rapidly increased, many of them were brought across the Black Sea to the British Army Hospital at Scutari, on the outskirts of Istanbul. It was here that Florence Nightingale arrived with 37 nurses in November 1854.
This image here actually shows what Scutari Hospital was like when Nightingale arrived. You can see that there were rats on the floor, there was sewage on the floor, and in fact most of the soldiers themselves were on the floor lying within that because there was a major problem with administration. Beds had been ordered and sent from the UK, but for the want of a signature they were sitting on the dockside rather than being in the hospital. Nightingale was completely alarmed about this and certainly again used her political influence to make sure that those items got released into the hospital. But then she came across a problem in the fact that Dr. John Hall, the chief army medic, just didn't want her there. He thought that it was no place for a woman. He couldn't see the point in having nurses anyway. And so he basically forbid her from doing anything at all to help. Nightingale, though, had an idea, and she realised, first of all, that she wanted to make sure that she only helped when she was asked, as that would mean then she'd have greater power in the long run. She also remembered the difference she'd made when she'd cleaned up the hospital back in Harley Street. So she asked her ladies to actually just start cleaning. And suddenly we've got order, we've got discipline, we've got hygiene standards. And Nightingale began to do that work. Dr. Hall still wasn't keen to have her around, and that's where actually she earns her name, the lady with the lamp. Because when all the soldiers were in bed at night, when Hall was sleeping and taking a rest, she took it on herself to actually walk around the many, many miles of Scutari Hospital with a lamp and actually just check the soldiers were all right. That wasn't necessarily doing anything medical or clinical. Nightingale hugely believed that compassion was what was missing from the way they were being treated. And she just went round and actually conversed with people as human beings, brought that lovely human touch to nursing. And that, I think, is one of her greatest legacies today too. So, I've mentioned the lamp, and here it is.
Oh wow, this is the original thing.
It is, and I think along with Athena, it is certainly one of our most popular exhibits here. We're so proud to have it. We know it came from her office in Scutari, so therefore she must have used it at some point, probably on a slightly rotational basis with some others, but this is the one, it's here, and is it what you expected?
Well, it does seem like something from Turkey. It doesn't seem like a British item.
It's a Turkish fanus, and so many of our visitors who come here are still shocked to see that, because they remember the typical images that perhaps have been shown of Nightingale, including on the old £10 note where she was holding a candle, or sometimes you see her holding something a little bit like a genie lamp. Now, the reason that happens to me is possibly the most interesting bit of the whole story, because the Crimean War is really interesting in the fact that it was the first war where there were journalists on the ground. That's why the stories were getting back to Britain of just how bad it was so quickly, and why the British public was so horrified and the nation needed that hero that Nightingale becomes. But whilst there were journalists there from the Times, from the Illustrated London News, all the other big publications of the day, there were no photographers, and nobody described the lamp in detail. So if you're sitting in an office writing a newspaper and you're told to do an illustration back in London, would you think, I better make it a Turkish lamp? Or would you just make one up? And that's why so often the lamp is portrayed wrong. So it's really nice to have it here, be able to tell that part of the story. And it does make me smile when I see it in other places, including the famous statue that's on Pall Mall in the centre of London, where again, she's holding the wrong sorts of lamp.
So tell me, what did the British public think of her?
She was the hero that the nation needed, because ultimately she cared, and she cared about the common man. She cared about people who were ultimately alone in a time of need. Remember, a lot of them would have left wives back in the UK who wouldn't have known whether they were dead or alive. Neither would their children. There was no system in place for them to send wages back home, so a lot of those women and children were destitute. So Nightingale worked with the Royal Bank of Scotland to put a system in place to get that back home. When soldiers died commonly, the army didn't let people know, which Nightingale was horrified about. And so she'd pick up her pen, she'd pick up a paper, and she would write to people and let them know. She really did care about individuals, and she really wanted to make sure that the soldiers felt comfortable because they'd given so much for the country, and she saw that that was her way of doing her duty as well. And if that meant she walked round at night because she wasn't wanted there, that's what she would do. And she kept doing that until Hall admitted that he was wrong and that actually there was a role for nurses, there was a role for compassion, and then she instructed her nurses to actually play their part, to carry on keeping the place clean, but also to help with administering bandages to wounds, helping in any way they could to actually make soldiers more comfortable.
And did her work, did it improve the plight of soldiers?
Very much so. Not instantly. I think one of the things to really realise is that when there's a war going on, you have to act quickly. It made some short-term differences. Actually, her helping to make sure that the Sanitation Commission came out and looked at the hospital, looked at the mess, they discovered that there was a dead horse in the well. A lot of the soldiers were dying from cholera too.
And what did Queen Victoria think of this other woman who was coming into the public sphere and gaining everyone's support?
I think she was very grateful at first, because ultimately the war was going badly. That had led to a number of riots in the country, and Queen Victoria needs to stabilise and really did care for the soldiers. So she was really grateful that was happening. I think she admired her because she saw that Nightingale was brave. She probably was a little bit concerned that she was sometimes acting outside of what a Victorian woman would do, which would have been quite shocking to a conservative like Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
But equally, it's wartime. People do very, very different things. And to actually have the story that was a positive story, that Britain were doing something good, would have been very much a lift for lateral morale. And certainly that's why I think that she became great friends with her afterwards. I think Nightingale was one of the few people that could actually jokingly rebuke the monarch at a time when treason was a very serious crime.
Yeah.
And so, it's really nice to see two strong women working together and supporting each other.
And of course, another woman who's around in the Crimean War is Mary Seacole. How did she come into it all?
Seacole inquired whether she could join as a nurse, but she didn't have the necessary paperwork to actually do so. Nightingale had left strict instructions that women should have a certain degree of experience, and also 2 references from British people of note. Sadly, Mary didn't have that. Her father, who was Scottish and a military officer, had great connections, but not enough to have introduced her in that way. So Seacole does perhaps one of the bravest things that we can actually think of, and she decides to travel there on her own. And she decided that what would be a good business would be to move to the front and actually open what was known as the British Hotel. Now, it wasn't a hotel as we would think of it. It was perhaps a bit more like a canteen or a restaurant for the officers. But while she was there, she would make sure that they were looked after, cared for. Her mother had been a doctoress in Jamaica, and she had quite a few what we'd call perhaps herbal remedies.
What about her and Florence? Were they pals? Were they rivals?
I think it's one of the great shames in British history that they're often presented as rivals. And then, from my opinion, there's really no reason for that to be the case. And I do wonder, to be honest, if it's pitched that way, partly because the media like the idea of two women being a little bit against each other. I think what we've got to accept is they were very different characters. Nightingale is very much about order, discipline. She wants to follow the science, follow what is there in terms of the rule book, and do what she can. Mary is an entrepreneur. She's quite a maverick in her own way too. She has been brought up with a Creole culture behind her. The two, as far as we know, only met once, but when they did meet, it was ultimately that Mary stopped off in Scutari on the way to the war front. I think they probably have had quite a lot of respect for each other, because they were both women trying to do their bit in this very difficult situation. And another favourite exhibit we've got is Nightingale's medical chest, which we've got just over here. Oh, yeah. And what's really nice to see is that there's some very basic things in here that women would have again often had within their kitchens. And when Nightingale writes Notes on Nursing in 1860 and draws on her memories from the Crimean War, what she's learned, she's often writing that in very simple language in order that the lady of the house can actually be the nurse of the house too. And I think that's really demonstrated here by just how basic the equipment is. But it shows you can make a difference, and particularly with fresh air, good ventilation, compassion, and giving the patient space.
Can you tell me about these objects in here? What were they?
Yes, certainly. We've got all sorts of things ranging from a pepper that actually would just be used like smelling salts to bring somebody round, through to the most basic of ointments, recognising that there would of course be everything from flea bites right the way up to sort of injuries for wounds like amputation and so on. Hygiene, again, very important, and the use of salt water, making sure that that's the best way of actually cleaning a wound.
Another treasure in the museum is what could be considered the first ever professional nursing uniform.
At the top we have the Scutari sash, which Nightingale introduced both to protect her ladies in order to make sure that nobody was approaching them who shouldn't be, and also so she could keep an eye on them, because as a disciplinarian she wanted to make sure that they weren't flirting with the soldiers, they were actually diligently doing their jobs as she expected. And this was brought in because there was no uniform at the time. Nursing as a profession didn't exist. The ladies would have worn a dark dress, then basically an apron or a pinafore, which was easy to change to keep clean. And then over the top we have the Scutari sash, which realistically just gives the name of the hospital, but the red makes it nice and bright and very vibrant. The ladies, we think, did actually sew their own. And I've got one here. Obviously it's a replica, and if you'd like to try it out.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Essentially it's just worn over the shoulder, a little bit like Miss World with a banner.
Yeah.
I can see you've done that before.
Yeah. And this was to stop the advances of the young men who were
very
recovering.
much. It just means that Nightingale can keep an eye out. It was done out of a spirit of care, both for the ladies themselves, but also for the patients. Some of the ladies would have perhaps got a little bit too distracted, so it was good she was able to keep them focused.
Did they have a lot of problems with romances and with the soldiers?
There are certainly cases documented that some of the ladies who were desperate to escape Victorian society, where you could hardly speak to anybody who wasn't going to be a future husband that was thought suitable by your family. So certainly some of the ladies would have gone wanting adventure. And, you know, Nightingale, you know, perhaps wanted them to have adventure, but in the spirit of looking after the soldiers rather than actually romancing with them.
Yeah.
I think this is possibly it's my favourite part of the museum. This register here is the register of nurses in the East, and literally records every nurse, over 200, that goes out with Nightingale to the Crimean War in various stages. This reads to me a little bit like a school report from the Victorian days, or certainly before even my time, because Nightingale wants the best. She wants high standards, and that's why she is strict, why she's disciplined. And she has no hesitation in sending people back for being drunk, for flirting with soldiers, and she records it all in fantastic detail. It can be quite interesting when relatives come and ask to look at this, and they've heard that their great granny worked in the Crimean War with Nightingale, and then when we have a look, we find out that they were a drunkard she sent home. Slightly embarrassing, but you know, that's history.
On that top line there, it says Miss Florence Nightingale, Superintendent of Nurses, Scutari, October the 23rd, 1854, and returned, can't quite read that, August something, I can't read it.
Yeah, the writing is very typically Victorian, quite flowery, and therefore is quite difficult to leave. Nightingale was, of course, the first nurse. She regarded herself as the leader, but also as part of the contingent. And actually, she does make sure that she's the last person to leave Scutari as well. So that wouldn't have been filled in right the way till the end. She stays right the way through to the end of the war, and then she travels back under the name Miss Smith. The reason that she does that is that she's hugely paranoid that she's going to arrive to fanfares, to bands on the ocean, to everybody giving her applause. She's a very reclusive character. She just doesn't want that. So she travels back under the name Miss Smith, sneaks into the country, gets the train up to Derbyshire, and then walks the couple of miles from the train station to the family home. Her family are obviously very shocked to see her. She lost a lot of weight. We think now she's probably suffering from brucellosis as well, so she would certainly have had quite a lot of fatigue, etc. It's something that's commonly caught from eating unpasteurised food. The effects of it are basically malaise, feeling completely drained, and she does actually collapse on walking into the hall. And from that day on, she actually suffers for the rest of her life, the next 50 years, with periods of being bedridden, and that's why her focus changes from being an active nurse and working on the front line to actually being a strategist, a campaigner, and she spends the rest of her career, the next 50 years, making sure that she can do all she can from her bed by writing letters, summoning people to see her, including prime ministers, to actually tell them what they should be doing to make sure that people of the UK are cared for.
Florence Nightingale will forever be remembered as the angel of the Crimea, the lady with the lamp. But perhaps her greatest legacy comes from the work she did when she returned to Britain.
So after recovering from her first major bout of illness, Nightingale realised she had to carry on her work. God had called her, after all, to establish a nursing profession, and what she'd done was look after some soldiers in the war, but nursing still had a long way to go. She realised that she had to campaign and she had to use her status in society for good. So straight away she began a letter writing campaign, and the people of the local village were so grateful to have her back. They donated this desk to her to actually say thank you for what you've done in the war. We know she treasured this, and she actually did use it on a daily basis. And she would write to all the politicians and actually explain that she didn't think it was right that the veterans were not being looked after. And whilst her interest started with looking after soldiers, because that's what she knew best after the Crimean War, it soon spread to being everybody. You couldn't say that she started the NHS, but to some very similar principles. That, of course, started many years after her, but she certainly didn't want to see anybody without food, without a place to stay, and without the very basics of healthcare. And this little desk is what she used to actually do a lot of that campaigning. We think during the course of her life she wrote about 14,000 letters. She was very quickly learnt that if she wanted to grab the attention of the politicians, she'd got to be quick, she'd got to be punchy, they'd got plenty to do. And she started to get more and more of an interest in presenting statistics. She waded through all the data she could find from the Crimean War and what had gone wrong, because she started to appreciate that gunshot wounds, amputations had caused so many deaths, but there was more to that. And actually it was due to all sorts of different things, and that therefore the army needed to get a grip on the whole equation rather than just thinking about people dying in one way. And one of the best ways she realised that she could do this was actually not to write reams and reams and reams, to present pictures, infographics. It's an urban myth that Nightingale invented the pie chart. That's certainly not true. But what she did do was work with William Farr and other statisticians of the day to create the coxcomb or the rose diagram, which we can see up here. And that was truly pioneering for the time. Ultimately, what it shows in this case, the one we have here, is how death rates were affected in India by those things that I've just talked about, pollution in water, other diseases. And it's really interesting, I think, and I like the fact we have this one on display, because whilst her interest started with the soldiers, because that's where she had the link, she was soon rattling the cage of the British government to say, if we're going to be in India, we need to care for the Indian people. It is wrong that we are not helping them more. And she certainly challenged the thinking of the day around what empire was about. She really wanted to be supportive. She was outraged when there was famine in the Indian continent and was absolutely scathing of the British government response until they acted. She just did not let it go. And it's, you know, it's no coincidence that Gandhi himself actually describes Nightingale as one of the inspirations of his life because of the way he felt that she represented the Indian people.
Wow, she was good at ruffling some feathers, it sounds. So can you tell me about this chart? Can you tell me what these big blue sections are? And all
Certainly. I mean, you straight away picked the blue sections. Yeah. And what that actually says in this diagram is how many people were dying from water-based diseases. We can see that it's a very effective way that within seconds people can get a basic grip of data. And she started to use these for all sorts of campaigns, whether it was about water quality in London, the need for poor reform to make sure that people had basics in the UK. And certainly, again, as she goes on to establish her nursing schools, they actually become more and more useful, because we've heard a lot in the last few weeks, over the year, the pandemic, the phrase evidence-based nursing. That is very much a Nightingale legacy. She used whatever data she could find to crunch it to help to come up with solutions. And part of those solutions are in creating systems that actually work, whether that's to do with the value of fresh air, to do with the value of space around a patient. We're seeing all those things relevant today. She also had some really great legacy in the way that nursing was actually taught. And we see that, and it's quite appropriate, the museum is on the site of her nursing school at St Thomas's. At the end of the Crimean War, a huge amount of money had been collected in Nightingale's honour, and the war had ended. There was a question what should be done with it, the so-called Nightingale Fund. Nightingale didn't need the money personally, it was offered to her several times, but she very much felt morally the money hadn't been collected for her, it had been for her to do the work. So she gave it some thought and decided the best thing to do was to establish a nursing school. I think it's very important we understand that she never stood at the front of the classroom and actually taught anybody. What she did was she had trusted matrons who led the sessions, but what was amazing was that it was always set up to be organic, so that once someone had progressed through the school and got some experience, they went off and set up another school. And in that way, the Nightingale method of teaching, of nursing, spreads throughout the globe very, very quickly, so that by the end of the century, you've actually got nursing schools right the way across the empire, and even in countries like Japan.
Yeah, well, it seems like she clearly had a very strong vision, but can you tell me about how her religious conviction came into that?
As we said, Nightingale, first of all, just before her 17th birthday, was in Hampshire at the family home. She felt God was talking to her and saying, you must do something with your life. And that faith never left her. But the really interesting thing in many ways to me is that while she felt that faith could help galvanise nurses, she also hugely believed that nursing should be secular. And by that I mean, prior to her, all nurse education was really around nuns and convents. Therefore, she felt there was a risk that people would often, when they should be looking after the body, perhaps they'd be a bit too tempted to look after the soul and actually preach at the same time.
Yeah.
Nightingale, as much as she believed in God and did believe that faith could help you, she didn't want that to be the case. And so when she went out to the Crimea, she deliberately took the same number of Protestants and Catholics with her. And when she established her nursing schools, she made sure that actually the curriculum was completely secular.
So tell me some of the other objects you've got on display here.
Certainly. We've got in the end here, we've got a copy within the drawers of her will, which is quite interesting, which is just there. It's quite interesting because, of course, Nightingale never earned a wage because Victorian ladies at the time that wasn't appropriate, but certainly she still did manage to amass a number of things. And we talk about her caring side. I think what's really interesting is that she really makes sure that those people who've worked with her throughout the years receive mementos, etc., because she remembers them, and she's very personal in the fact that she remembers, for example, that one lady particularly liked horses, so she donates to her a small silver tin that actually has horses on the side. I love this photograph. What it is a photograph of her memorial service at St Paul's Cathedral.
Oh, wow.
Now, amazingly, Nightingale was offered the opportunity to be buried in Westminster Abbey, which on the whole is used for royal family crypts.
So that was quite a gesture at the time.
That's an amazing gesture, and it really shows her status. She didn't want that to happen because, realistically, she didn't want the fame, even after her death. Her first choice, interestingly enough, was actually to have her body donated to medical science. This is possibly my favourite Nightingale story. But as I'm sure you're aware, at the time, the bodies that were used for medical science were criminals. So her family were just, that cannot happen.
I think none of that.
And
yeah.
out of respect for them, she did actually agree in the end that that wouldn't be the case. And they agreed between them that the family plot at Embley, down in Hampshire, then St Margaret's Church, is actually where she is. But amazingly, whilst it's a quite elaborate headstone about the size of you or I, there's just the simple letters FN on there. There is nothing more that would actually say to anybody of her great achievements. But the nation needed to have some sort of ceremony. So St Paul's stepped in, and that is ultimately how popular it was. And they actually made sure they used the same hymns, a lot of the same readings that took place at the service, at the family service down in Hampshire at St Paul's.
It looks like all these nurses.
You can see that a huge number of nurses attended. Many more would have wanted to. You see them being bussed in. It reminds me almost of like a royal wedding today or something, where again just anybody who and everybody would want to be there. And it's really nice again to see that some of the rank and file, the normal nurses of the day, were selected in order that they could go along, give their thanks and honour ultimately the lady who started their profession.
To this day, a commemoration is held every year at Westminster Abbey on the 12th of May, Florence Nightingale's birthday, to celebrate her enormous contribution to nursing.
Nursing was now a profession, and more to the point, it was a profession that ladies, people of status, could enter and actually have their own money, actually have their own existence. And if you think that just a few short years later, the First World War breaks out, and virtually every royal family in Europe gets its princesses to actually become part of the nursing effort, that is a phenomenal step change from the Mrs. Gamp figure, the woman who was the equivalent of working in the sex industry,
Yeah.
you know, to actually have princesses from the great houses of Europe wanting to do that, and that is all because of the work of Nightingale.
Nightingale certainly has an immense legacy, but what was she actually like as a woman? It's time for me to find out.
Oh, Florence, so nice to meet you.
Hey, a pleasure to meet you. So delightful to have company.
Heard an awful lot about you.
Good things, I hope.
Of course, of course. Now, where do we find ourselves here? This looks very homely.
Oh, well, you're in my bedroom on South Street in London, of course.
And how long have you been living here?
Well, I started living here just after the Crimea, when my darling sister Parthenope persuaded Papa that we must live next door to each other. So I lived next to her and her husband, which meant there was always someone to feed the cat.
So how do you and Parthenope get on?
Well, when we were younger, there were a few disagreements. She did not want me to be a nurse and was rather frustrated at it. We actually had a rather big argument about it where she threw her bracelets at me and I fainted.
Oh my gosh.
But when we got older, it was much better and she began to manage my image in public and sorts of things like that.
A publicity manager then, how handy. Now, tell me about your room. What sort of things do you do in here?
I love to read books and spend time with my 20 cats.
20 cats?
20 cats, yes. My favourite is called Mr. Bismarck. He's ever so sweet.
So, Amber, do you enjoy being Florence Nightingale?
It's so much fun. You can have so much fun with her. There's so many details about her life. The research is endless. I've been doing this for over a year now, and still I'm finding new facts. She wrote so many letters. She's well recorded, to say the least, and she's so much fun to be.
So this is Florence's bedroom, and it was in a house which she lived in London. Can we go and visit that house today?
Unfortunately not. As with a lot of historical sites in London, war and bombing has unfortunately meant that you can't go and visit her home. She does have a blue plaque on South Street where her house used to sit. So we've had to recreate this through photographs and sort of knowing pieces and bits that could go into it. But we do actually have one small piece of her home still, and that's the door knocker that's on the house. I love just looking at it and thinking, you know, who knocked on that? Did Dickens use it? You know, one of Queen Victoria's assistants might have been there. It's really nice to have.
So we know all about Florence and her life and what she achieved, but your job is to relive Florence from the inside. Can you tell me what she was really like, her personality?
She was a very stern woman. She had quite an odd sense of humour, I would say. She was very masculine. She was ahead of her time. I think she was a lot like strong female figures we see today, but in the Victorian era, you know, that was totally different. And sort of the men and politicians that would meet her were so blown away by her intelligence. She had a lot of drive, a lot of sort of panache for what she was doing.
And how do you bring to life Florence today in your job and, you know, visiting all these other schools and educational practices?
It all starts with the voice. That's most important.
Yeah.
So the sort of received pronunciation. Here we've got a recording of her voice. So you can almost get that taste of what she was like, but not quite enough to know fully.
I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work of my life. Florence Nightingale.
And she obviously had a very close relationship with her sister and her father, even when she was quite old. Can you tell me how her father stayed as this kind of paternal figure even throughout her later life?
Well, money.
A
lot of the time. Because she was a woman, financial independence was really difficult. I think Florence was unique in the fact that they had the Nightingale Fund that the Times newspaper started when she came back from the Crimea.
Okay.
So she had a little money in that sense that she could start the Nightingale nursing school, but she was still a woman, you know, she couldn't do so many things. So her father gave her an allowance for a very long time.
So she was basically supported by her wealthy father throughout her life.
If she hadn't been as wealthy, I don't think she'd have been as successful.
And tell me about her not marrying.
She came close. So there were 3 different people that she courted, but the person she came closest to was called Richard Monckton Milnes. He was a philanthropist and a poet and just sort of your typical Victorian man.
Okay, sounds like a good catch.
Yeah, he proposed to her and she actually went, I don't know if I can give up my freedom, and went on holiday for a year. She went travelling, then came back and said no to him. But there's all sorts of hypotheses why she didn't. I think she just found it a fuss. I think she had other things to focus her energy on.
So focused on the...
And she kept her independence, which is most important. Yeah.
And can you tell me about some of these photos you've got on the wall here?
This one here is one of the last ones of Florence and Parthenope together.
Oh wow, that's her and her sister.
Yeah, that's her and her sister together, and that's actually her sister's husband there.
So they lived to pretty old, those two.
Yeah, Parthenope did die before Florence, which I think must have been quite lonely for her. She was so close to them. But yeah, Florence lived right up until 90. So just a phenomenal changing into modern times.
Now I heard that she described herself often as a man of action and a man of business. Tell me her relationship on being, you know, with men and working in a man's world.
I always get the impression that she was very much, you know, if she was working with someone and they tried to do something, she'd be like, no, just let me do it. I'm going to do it right. Just let me get straight to it. She had a lot of frustration of having to stand back and watch people do what she wanted to do but wrong. And she was very good at explaining herself and sort of her use of diagrams and statistics made men listen to her because she said, well, I have the facts here. I might be a woman, but these are the facts at the end of the day. So it helped a lot.
And tell me what you have to wear this outfit a lot. What's it like to wear? What are you wearing and what does it feel like?
So there's a few different costumes or outfits that Florence has. This is the one that I wear the most. It's the most comfortable. But this is based on the dress that we've got in the collection over in the bookcase section of the museum. And Florence didn't like to wear anything too fussy. So she liked simple colours, straightforward, you know, she's wearing clothes because she just wanted to. I had to even. I even read that she didn't like corseting, she hated corsetry, you know. If she could have worn trousers, I really think she would have. I often joke, when I'm getting changed, I'm wearing trainers with this, And we always joke that the real Florence would have worn trainers or Crocs even, or something comfy and practical.
Yeah.
She wasn't dressing to look fine and beautiful.
So, in a nutshell, why should we care about Florence Nightingale today? What did she do for the world?
What didn't she do? She was a pioneer for women, for her gender. She completely revolutionised nursing, and a lot of the things nurses use today, especially during the pandemic, stemmed from Florence's writing and research. She was such a hard worker and had such a passion and drive, and I think all of us can see a little bit of Florence in our own work and what we do. I think that's really nice.
And the museum here today, I know that you're facing a bit of hardship. Can you tell us where the museum's looking for the future?
A lot of my work stems in the future because I work in our education department, and I'm performing via Zoom to children, and at the end of everything I say, and if anyone here wants to be a nurse, you can still study like Nightingale did today. And the little faces of them all, they get so excited, and it's really inspiring, and I think that's the best focus, is to sort of maintain the past so we can nurture the future.
As we face the COVID-19 pandemic, Nightingale's emphasis on hygiene and ventilation is more relevant than ever. Even the pop-up hospitals have been named after her. Yet the lockdown has taken its toll on the museum, forcing it to close its doors to visitors for the foreseeable future. If you'd like to support the efforts of Dave and his team, you can still visit the museum virtually, browse the shop, and keep up to date on social media. And by keeping this museum alive, we can ensure Nightingale's remarkable story will continue to inspire nurses across the world for generations to come.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.